Midway along the journey of our life, I awoke to find myself in a dark wood. With this mysterious sentence, Dante Alighieri begins his Divine Comedy. Dante, who is considered the greatest poet in the West, at least according to Borges, tells us in his comedy about the journey on which he embarks in the middle of his life, at the age of 35, a journey to the worlds of the dead. This journey has three parts to it. We begin with Dante in a dark forest, on his way to the Inferno, which is the Christian hell, inhabited by the souls of sinners who had not atoned for their sins. The second part is Purgatory, the steep mountain where the souls who had not yet been allowed to enter paradise reside. And paradise, or Eden, is the kingdom of the dead where the righteous and saints lived with God, and where Dante's beloved Beatrice is waiting for him in the sky. Now, in this conversation, we're going to talk mainly about the Inferno and what Dante encountered there. But before we descend into the underworld, we too, just like Dante himself, must find us a faithful guide who will accompany us, make sure we don't stumble, and that we return safely. Now, this guide, our guest today, is called William Cook. Hello, William, and thank you for joining us in our journey today.
It's a pleasure to be your guide to hell.
Yeah. Before we start, I'm going to introduce you. Professor William R. Cook is the Distinguished Teaching Professor of History at the State University of New York, where he has taught since 1970. His books include Images of St. Francis of Assisi and Francis of Assisi, The Way of Poverty and Humility. But I got to know you from your course about Dante's Divine Comedy, which you delivered with Professor Ronald B. Hertzman at the Great Courses. Now, William, I want to start out by asking about books that need guides and keys to unlock them, because I host a book club in Jerusalem, and just recently we read the first chapter of James Joyce's Ulysses, and right from the start I felt that most of the participants didn't like the book, that they felt that it's basically impossible to read it and enjoy it without complementary literature that will explain the work. Now, is this the case when we approach Dante's Divine Comedy? Because Dante throws at us countless names of people we've never heard of, references to Christian theology that we probably don't know, and more and more. What's your opinion about that?
Of course, in some ways, that's true with every book written a long time ago or in a different place, whether we're reading the Iliad or we're reading Dante, or for that matter, we're reading Shakespeare or even Dickens in the 19th century. And so the Divine Comedy, however, particularly needs a guide because Dante meets so many people from different historical places, refers to countless ancient and earlier medieval books, and also is expecting you to be familiar with the politics and the culture of medieval Italy, which of course wasn't a country at all. It was a number of city-states and kingdoms in what we now call the country of Italy. So in one sense, it really is important to have a guide, and most editions of the Divine Comedy in translation do have guides for you within them, an introduction, a series of footnotes, usually a couple drawings so we can sort of picture the way Dante pictures hell, and so on and so forth. But what's important is not that you can pass a test on, what author or what event is Dante referring to in Canto something or other of the Divine Comedy, but rather we really understand the purpose for writing it. That it's one of those books that at the same time is deeply personal. It really is about this person, Dante Alighieri, who is a real human being who lived in Florence. And it's also about every person, because the journey that he takes is in some way, however unrecognizable to us it might seem, in some way his journey is the human experience, is the human story. And so it's good, I think, if people are reading it for the first time, when they buy a translation, Get one with a good introduction, get one with notes and refer to them when you have to, but don't rely on the notes, and just read the poem. It's Dante's voice you want to hear, not the guy who writes the footnotes and not the person who writes the introduction. So, yes, it helps to have a guide. And just as Dante needed a guide at first, especially when he was completely lost, but it's also important not to let the foreignness of the fact that it's written in 14th century Italy, the distance in space and time, or the distance in religion from the person reading the book, that shouldn't get in the way of finding the universality of Dante's story.
Yeah, I mean, in your lecture series that I referenced before, you say something very interesting that the poem confronts each reader with his or her actions, motivations, beliefs, and then you go out to tell a very, very interesting story that you don't go into detail, and maybe you would like to elaborate right now, but you say that you taught in a prison, and one of the inmates said that this is basically his story about
Yes,
one of the sinners in the poem.
that's right. And I'll tell you that story. It was in a maximum security prison in the United States, and it was a college course. It was being taken for credit inside the prison. And this man was a convicted murderer. And I knew that. I didn't know what all the criminals did, but sometimes they talked about what they had done. But anyway, I knew he was a convicted murderer. And I was teaching the fifth canto of Inferno, where Dante meets those who are guilty of the sin of lust. And the point of that story, as Dante tells it, is not so much let's have a sort of study of the sin of lust, but it is to understand that what the sinner is doing in his conversation with Dante is making excuses for everything. In other words, yes, yes, my husband killed me, and yes, I was having adultery, but it really wasn't my fault. I couldn't help myself. It just sort of happened. And this guy puts up his hand and says, "That's me. That's why I'm here." And what a moment of revelation. Now, this guy's not just an American prisoner, he's a Native American. He'd had a tough life. He got in a brawl. I don't know whether he was drunk, but at some sort of festival, and killed somebody. And how can he reflect on that as I think he spent 25 years in prison. He did get out eventually. I actually ran into him by accident once he was out of prison. Oh, wow. And we started talking about Dante, by the way, which was especially interesting. But at any rate, we're all on a journey wherever we physically are. And we need to recognize first that we're on a journey. And we need to recognize how we learn about ourselves. And this is a place where it would have been almost impossible for him to look at himself and say, I know how I got into this place as a murderer and left my wife and daughter outside to fend for themselves. He was lost. And this poem helped him to focus not on 14th century Italy, but on him. Because he heard in those denials of this character that Dante is talking to, her name is Francesca. He heard in her story something that sounded painfully familiar to himself. And the first second, you are pained by that. But he realized very quickly this was not something, that's a bad thing because he's struck by a kind of guilt maybe he'd never had before. But this will help him to start that process of liberation from that. And I went to his graduation inside the prison. He got his college degree. And when I was there, he introduced me to his wife and daughter. And he said, this is one of the few days in my life my daughter can be proud of me. And so if I look at the moments of his education, if he looked at the moments of his education, and education in the broadest sense of, getting out of the darkness of ignorance, I think he would say that moment discussing Canto 5 of Inferno was a turning point in his life. It will not be for a lot of other people. Maybe another passage will, maybe no passage will. But literature gives us the opportunities to look at our lives. And Dante says this in the first line of the poem. You always say, okay, this poem has 14,000 lines. Let's look at line 1. Then students think you're going to spend the same amount of time on every line and that they'll be there for 40 years. But anyway, the first line says, in the middle of the journey of our life. Okay. So it's when he's having what we call today, I guess, a middle age crisis. It's in the middle of his life. He's 35 years old, and the biblical age of life is 70. So he is, by that definition, literally in the middle of his life. But in the middle of the journey, life is a journey. Life's not sitting still. Life is a journey. It may not take you where you want to go or the same place anybody else, but life is a journey of our life. Now, he might have said my life, or he might have said our lives, but he says our life, meaning each of us is an individual and there's a common pattern. And so he's telling us in line 1 out of this 14,000 line poem, this is about somebody different than you. This is about somebody whose destiny may be different than you, but you can walk with that person along the way and learn something, because our lives are different, but my life and your life are part of the human condition. So Dante lays it, it's easy to say this to students, but Dante tells you all you need to know about reading the poem in line 1. In the middle of the journey of our life. Then the next line, I found myself in a dark wood. It is a crisis. Something's gone wrong. And we know his life at that time. He was living in Florence. He was successful. He was a well-known poet. He was a middle-class guy. He'd held offices in government in Florence. And yet he describes himself in a dark wood. And I think we all know that at some level, at some point of our lives, we wake up and say, what in the hell am I doing? Where's my life going? What does it matter that I got that promotion, or I have this degree, or I went to that university, or I won this medal on the track team? What do all those things mean in the big picture? And so this is a poem with all kinds of action and graphic things going on, but it's asking us to be reflective about our own lives, because that empowers us to take chances and make changes. So I think this is a very challenging poem from the very first line.
Yeah, and I love the idea of a journey, because as you said, we start in a wood, a dark wood, which, I don't know, throws me, at least in my mind, to fairy tales or knight's quests, and there's something almost William Blakey about it. I mean, it's a wood, but it's also, as you said, a symbol of a place in your life, which is maybe a crisis of meaning.
Sure, we talk all the time about midlife crisis. You sort of, you've got your spouse and 3 children, you've got a good job, you've got a house, you've got a dog, you've got all these things. And at some point, I think, even if people are thinking that their lives mean getting more of that stuff, you sort of say, but wait a minute, is this all there is to life? Even if you've had what we would define by any good way, a good life. You've traveled, you've gone to school, you've had certain advantages, because Dante was well educated, again, lived in a wonderful city, had a job, had a family, a wife and children, had a high position in the government. And suddenly, which that sounds like plenty for a life. And it wasn't enough, and it wasn't sufficient. And there was something deeply lacking. And this is his quest to find deeper meaning, maybe even a somewhat different trajectory of his life than he had imagined. We hear this all the time, right? You have people who retire and say, well, I did everything right. I went to college, I got married, I had kids, my kids all went to college, I had a good job, we had a nice house, we took a vacation to France, our kids saw all the national parks. I'm 65. What's it all about? What's it all about? And Dante is asking us to stop and think and come along with him. I mean, Dante always has a guide, whether it is Beatrice in heaven, or whether it is Virgil in hell and purgatory, Dante always has a guide. And now what Dante the poet, not Dante the character, what Dante the poet is saying, I want to be your guide. I want to tell you about how I faced that, not in a literal sense of what I did the next day or what I checked out at the library, but let me tell you in a literary creation of mine about this, and let me see if I can do it in a way that you will find something to hold on to, just like my student Tom found something to hold on to get him started by reading the fifth canto of the Divine Comedy. We not only all need to be pilgrims, we all need to be like my student Tom. We all need at some point to say, that's me. That's how I got where I am now. And that will not all be terrible news. People have real achievements, real accomplishments, do wonderful and virtuous things. But Dante's going to put that all in a bigger context. And I always tell students, if you read even 1/3 of the Divine Comedy, one of the three parts of it, and you haven't thought deeply about yourself, as I like to say in colloquial, you ain't doing it right. You're just not doing it right if all you say is, I've got to now memorize enough of this story to write an exam to get a good grade. You blew it. You're not getting a real education. You may be getting a degree, but you're not getting an education unless you can find something there, or in any great work of literature, or great work of art, or in many works of nonfiction. You're looking for that sort of, and I don't mean this in a particular way, religious conversion, but you need a conversion. And something that the word conversion means to turn toward, right? The con part means toward, and the verse means to turn. So you need a conversion. You need to turn towards something. You need to think about what your highest goals and desires are. Make sure they're the right ones as much as you can, and then find ways to turn yourself so that you can follow a path to those things. And Dante's saying, I'm going to be your guide. He's been guiding a lot of people in the last 700 and some years.
You know what struck me the most for the first time that I read the poem, because there's this idea that Dante is actually settling scores, like like the famous Monty Python sketch with Michelangelo is painting all this popes and whatnot, but referencing the fifth canto, the exact canto, Dante is listening to the story of Francesca, and then he fainted. I mean, he emphasizes with the sinners. So in a sense, it's not about settling scores. It's about learning what exactly?
That's right. I mean, and that is something we certainly do, whether we're watching the news or whether it's in our own personal lives. Very often we're persuaded by a good telling of a story. And it is the way, I mean, Francesca is a very dramatic character in all this. And she tells this very persuasive story that this terrible thing happened to her that led to her death, but she isn't responsible for it. Things happened to me. I was misled by a book, by a person, and so on and so forth. And she basically refuses to accept free will. You're not guilty of anything if you have no will. If you don't have the power to choose, then any kind of judgment upon you would be unfair. And what Dante begins to realize, I think, there is that she's really sort of feeding him a line. I mean, he doesn't quite know it yet, but he starts saying, oh my gosh, I'm feeling sorry for her. And I'm sort of weeping for her and fainting for her. And of course, when he sort of gets up off the floor and continues his journey, he's got to reflect that this whole journey is meaningless if I don't make real choices. She claims she never made real choices. I've got to deal with that because we all do that. This is not my fault. I really couldn't help it. We all know that one. And Dante's, first of all, got to come face to face with the fact that whether he wants to admit it or not, he chooses the life he has. Of course, certain things are inflicted upon you. You have no control over. You don't have control over wars or most diseases or whatever. But at some point, Dante has to recommend that the choices he makes are free choices, and that therefore he's responsible for them. And it's going to take him a while, even through hell, to come to that point. And in most of the first 18 cantos, he sort of sympathizes with the sinners, or he just sort of gets angry at them. And it's only really in the 19th canto where he meets a corrupt pope, where Dante doesn't say, what are you doing? Why are you here? How come you're here? Dante said, stay where you are, meaning I understand why you're being punished. And that's sort of a revelation along the way. He has many revelations along the way. But that's one of them where, for the first time, really, he sides with the judge, God, rather than the person who is suffering in hell. And that's when he can take himself more seriously, when he realizes there's a justice to this place. Hell is a place of justice. It's not where somebody caught a bad break. It's a place of justice. And therefore, along the way, I think the 19th canto is the most important single place in Inferno, but all along the way, he's having to come to grips with, in a sense, the challenge of freedom. The challenge of, I have the power of choosing. I can say yes or no. I can seduce this person or not. Those are choices I make. It isn't, like there was a comedian about 50 years ago who always, when he got in trouble, said, the devil made me do it. No, the devil doesn't make you do it. You make yourself do it, or you allow yourself to do it. And so a lot of Inferno is simply coming to grips with the common human assumptions that we're just sort of moving along in life, and we're kind of chess pieces on a chessboard. And therefore, we don't really have to take responsibility for what we do. And we really don't have to challenge ourselves to change. And so in many ways, Inferno is about that rediscovery of the freedom of the will. And then we talk about how that freedom that we have needs to be directed in the other parts of the poem. We see it in progress in purgatory, and we see it accomplished in heaven. So it's a poem where, again, it's a very long poem, 14,000 lines, but it really is a poem. It's divided into pieces, and each of those pieces is divided into pieces. So there are 100 cantos and 3 parts of it, but it's one poem. And unfortunately, very few people read all 3 parts.
Yeah, and before we started recording, you talked about the famous line about the French sewers. I mean, the Paris sewers.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's a line by Dorothy Sayers. I think a lot of people know her for her mysteries. She wrote a long time ago in England in the 20th century, but she also translated the Divine Comedy. But anyway, I think her great line is, she says, if you read only Inferno and think you understand Dante, it's like seeing only the sewers of Paris and assuming you've seen everything. The sewers of Paris have the same outline as the city of Paris, but the city of Paris is very different than being in the sewers. And so too many people read the Inferno, and it seems to have a kind of climax to it because Dante meets Satan. And Satan's down there at the very bottom of hell, chewing on 3 souls. Satan has 3 mouths, which of course parodies the Trinity, the Christian Trinity. And in one mouth, he's got Judas, and in the other mouth, he's got the 2 murderers of Julius Caesar, people who betrayed church and state, if you will. And so they see Satan, and he's got his ugly flapping wings and all that sort of stuff. And you sort of say, well, this is over. We forget that at the very end of the canto, he and his guide climb out of heaven, which is in the center of the earth. That's where Satan is. And when they get to the surface, they see light. And in fact, we know from the calendar that Dante presents is that he enters hell on Good Friday and comes out on Easter Sunday. And so, it'd be like going to church during Holy Week and going for Good Friday and not going on Easter, not thinking Easter matters anymore. So when Dante comes out into the light, he's only a third of the way on the journey that he's going to be taken on. And unfortunately for readers, because it almost always comes in three different volumes, the way we print Dante today, there are very few prints of it all in one volume. So we have Dante, so we sort of finished it, right? We sort of finished Inferno. And if that's probably all you read in college, if you read anything of Dante's. And therefore, my guess is for every 100 people that read Inferno, 4 read the rest of the Commedia. So if there's one thing I'd say to anybody who's finished the Inferno, other than I'm glad you read it, is okay, now you're a third of the way through this journey. Let's get with it. You go buy your Purgatory and then you go buy your Paradiso. And when you read the whole thing, let's sit down and talk.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting take, and I think that if we focus too much about the Inferno, we do get this sense that I talked about of Dante's only settling scores, but he has a larger message, as you said. And there's also, I think, a very important lesson in the sense that when we do wrong, we know that we're doing wrong. I mean, it's not a problem of knowledge, it's a problem of choice, as you said, of choosing wrong, basically. Yeah.
And it is important, of course. I mean, Dante would be the first person to say that we need knowledge. We are, after all, thinking beings, and after all, a knowing beings. After all, Homo sapiens means knowing, a human who knows. So we are knowing creatures. And so we have to ask what kinds of help there are. And I think as Dante leads us on through the whole poem, one part is we can help ourselves. We can read. We can learn things from the wisest people who have lived. And for Dante, that doesn't just mean scriptures, and it doesn't just mean Christian writers. It's clear he's very familiar, for example, with the writings of Aristotle and many other pagans. And after all, his guide through 2/3 of the Divine Comedy is a pagan. That is to say, it's the Roman poet Virgil, who died before Jesus was born. So we need to learn, and we need to know what our sources are of learning. And Dante certainly gives us a lot in the people he meets or the people he refers to throughout the whole poem. And so we participate in all that. But we also, from Dante's perspective, also need God's help. We need grace, which is defined as an undeserved gift from God. Grace is not a reward for getting an A in the exam. You can now go out and I'll buy you a gift. Grace is an undeserved and free gift. And so for Dante, we don't start with that, but we will eventually come to understand that. And knowing that our sources are in our own intellect, and that is, it's important but not sufficient. All this is part of Dante's larger scheme of things.
There's something I always ponder about this poem. Why do we need, Jesus came and gave us the gospel, God's word. So why do we need, or Dante needs, to go to the land of the dead that has 3 parts, as I said, to find there the truth, basically? Can he find it in life?
Yeah, I think the answer is because Dante is really screwed up. That he's got really wrong values. I mean, he doesn't sit down and write part of the poem that's simply a confession of all of his bad stuff to us. But I think Dante recognizes that in his desire, well, when he goes through the land of purgatory, when he goes up the 7-story mountain, for example, the first terrace he comes to is pride. And Dante sort of makes a remark that if when I die, I get to purgatory, which means I'll be getting to heaven, I'm going to spend a long time on the terrace of pride. In other words, that's one of my grievous sins. And I'm recognizing that. And then when he gets to the next terrace, which is envy, he says, if I ever get back here, I'm going to pass through envy very quickly. Envy's not my problem. Pride is. And so are a couple of the other sins where he focuses. So everybody's going to take a different journey down into hell, learning in different places, and everybody's going to take a different journey up the 7-story mountains, cleansing the sins that are most serious that held him back or her back in their lives. So Dante would say, a lot of people seem to be able to get on track with God without having to take the journey I got. And when Dante first has Virgil come to him and said, by the way, I'm gonna be your guide, that's pretty cool. Right? If you're a poet, that's like, Shakespeare saying, I'm going to help you write a play. This is the Virgil is the ultimate, because Dante didn't have the Iliad or the Odyssey, by the way. But he knew about them. He hadn't read them because they didn't exist in Latin. But he had read Virgil, and Virgil was his sort of writer hero. And so Virgil says, I've been sent by your old girlfriend from heaven to come and take you on a journey. And, I think probably your first reaction is, especially when you learn at the end, you're going to get to meet your old girlfriend. You're going to say, oh boy, what have I done that's great to deserve this? And then, of course, the answer is you haven't done anything to deserve it. And in fact, it's because Beatrice, who loves you in heaven, realizes you're so screwed up that the usual ways of getting out of that won't work. You need this special trip because nothing short of that would get you out of the mess you're in. So it all starts not as a reward for Dante, but as a sort of emergency kit to Dante because he's so screwed up, which presumably means he's caught up in the political wheelings and dealings of Florence. He has a wife, but he might be lusting after various other women, and so on and so forth. And so Dante, who on the surface, he's a great Florentine. He's in the government, he's in a business, he's got a wife, he's got 4 kids, and all that sort of stuff. Who wouldn't look up to that kind of guy? But this is a journey to say, Dante, you've got to reconstruct yourself, because what you've constructed is not what's going to get you to heaven. It may look good on earth. You may get lots of adulation from people who say, boy, I wish I were like that guy. But God doesn't work by those standards. And so Dante is actually getting, we might call it remedial education, rather than a great gift by meeting with Virgil and having the chance to go through the afterworld. And Dante wants us to understand that he's at the bottom. He doesn't understand anything. Again, when he hears Francesca telling this story, I couldn't help this, I couldn't help that. This book fell into my hands. How could I not be lured into the sins that are in that book? That's sort of her pitch. And we know that Dante bought it because, as you pointed out, he sort of faints on and falls to the floor of hell. He was so sad to hear her story. He's got a long way to go. And again, we have marks along the way, like Inferno 19 with his encounter with his Pope, where we see more dramatically than in some other cantos that he is gradually starting to kind of get it.
When Dante and Virgil head into hell, in Canto 3, they stand before a gate that says, abandon all hope, ye who enter. I mean, why should the sinners abandon all hope? Because it seems to me that maybe it's because, as you said, they're only making excuses. They can't even understand the fact that they're actually sinners, that they are at fault here.
We have to start with all humans have, in various degrees, obviously, intellect, and they have free will. And we learn in purgatory pretty early on that you can make a turn toward God with your final gesture as you're dying. And that's enough. That's enough. We have story of a guy who's lived a miserable life, and he's in a battle and he's mortally injured and he's sort of groveling around. And he says, Mary, his last word. That's enough. He's in purgatory, which means he's going to go to heaven. That we can repent to the last breath of literally the last breath of our life. But we have to repent. The difference between heaven and hell's full of unrepentant sinners, and heaven's full of repentant sinners. So both all places have heaven, have sinners, because starting with Adam, we've all sinned. Dante meets Adam and Eve, of course, in paradise. But what we have to understand is because we are born sinners, at some point we have to make, again, the word, a conversion, turning toward God as opposed to turning toward ourselves or toward money or toward beautiful other bodies or whatever it is. We've got to learn to turn toward God. We need to convert. And so that's so that hell is a place only for unrepentant sinners. Once you die, that's it. And but up to the very second, and again, Dante's in the middle of his life. So Dante is being given by grace this chance. I mean, after all, if God didn't approve of all this, Beatrice wouldn't be able to go get Virgil, who lives in hell, but he's going to go back, who lives in hell, who is then going to guide Dante through this spectacular process. So up to the last breath, you can say something or make a gesture to turn toward God. Once you're dead, then that's why there is the need to abandon all hope when you enter the gates of hell.
And what is interesting about Virgil, for example, is you said he lives in hell, and Homer is with him, and Aristotle and Plato, but they all live in the first circle of hell, which is actually not so bad. I mean, you're far away from God, but it seems that, I don't know, they're throwing parties, they're doing
They're having great intellectual
discussions and
conversations, right?
symposiums. Sorry?
Yeah, well, and I think that is something that seduces us. The first area of hell, which is for the non-believers, is Dante's there. He meets really interesting pagans, for example, Plato, Aristotle. That's where Virgil is. He meets Muslims who are also scholars that he had read, were translated from Arabic in the 12th century into Latin. And so Dante had read some of these, and they're all there, and they seem to be having a good time. But as Dante explains later, their punishment is they don't have any tortures, but they live without hope. Because this is the best they can do, and this isn't the best there is. And so that is the, perhaps in some ways, the least of the punishment. I mean, they don't have their tongues being pulled out, or they're not buried in holes upside down or whatever, like some of the later sinners. But they live without hope. And I think if we stop and take that seriously, what would our lives be like? Not just in terms of theological hope, but we watch, for example, the people who have very bad medical diagnoses. What happens when you're convinced, I can't ever get better? I'm just simply, withering away and dying. And so we have to imagine an eternity of knowing there's this other life and having talked about it and written about, sort of an ideal existence, and know you never have a chance ever for all time to experience that. That's the punishment of the first circle.
Which seems to me the human condition. No, we're in one place and we want to get to another. I mean, that's the eternal longing of being a human. But the Christian gospel does tell you that there is a place. I mean, you can be
Right.
near to God if you're born after Christ came. Yeah.
Yes, and by the way, there are lots of arguments that people have made over time that say that they think there are things Dante says in the Paradiso that at least might hint at Virgil might ultimately be saved. I don't think that's right, but there are some serious Dante scholars who have proposed that Virgil would become the one exception to the rule. But that's not the way I read the poem. Virgil is, for all of what he does for Dante, he's going to return there to the first circle of hell.
And why does a poet is Dante's guide because he is a poet. There's something about poetry that could, I don't know, spread the truth better than theologians or philosophers.
Yes, I think so. I mean, in Paradiso, Dante honors all kinds of folks. He meets Thomas Aquinas, for example, guy that wrote, more pages than you can imagine of theology. And he and Dante actually overlapped a few years of life together. Thomas Aquinas died in 1270. Dante was born in 1265. So he's not quite, sort of barely contemporary. So, I mean, we're going to meet scholars, we're going to meet military heroes, we're going to meet, all kinds of different, quote unquote, virtuous people in heaven in different categories who do different things. But clearly, one of the things that we want to say about Dante is, and he's going to meet his great great grandfather, who was a crusader, by the way. But I think this is the important thing. Dante's a head guy. I mean, he's a smart guy. By the way, people love to argue where he got his education because he's really smart. He's really read, tons of stuff at a time when you couldn't go, when you couldn't just not only go into Amazon, but you also can't go to Borders or Barnes and Noble or whatever to buy a book. And there have been some English scholars, for example, that argue, well, Dante's so damn smart. He must have come to Oxford and we just don't know it. I mean, there's just, everybody wants to claim him as an alum, I guess we would say. People wanting to have him go to Paris when he goes into exile because Paris was the intellectual, theological capital of Europe at the time. There's no evidence for that. I mean, he read a lot of books, but Dante was an intellectual. So what God is going to do is use the gifts God gave to Dante to provide a way out of his out of his situation of being in the dark wood of error. That God is going to come to us where we are, which is also a very important thing. If you're a person, with not very much education, and you somehow sort of got to know this Dante guy, you got, God, Dante's read everything. He talks to all these theologians. I don't know what in the hell they're all talking about. How's God ever going to help me? The answer that Dante really is providing is God's going to come to you where you are. God's going to find, it may not be Thomas Aquinas for you. It may not be Virgil for you. It may be somebody very different, metaphorically, that would rescue you because God comes to meet you where you are and offers gifts that you're capable of accepting. He can't come to somebody who has a 7th grade education in the middle of his life and say, all you got to do is get caught up in your theology, and then I'm ready to teach you things. That doesn't work. No, God's coming to Dante where Dante is. And I think the point of that is not that everybody ought to be like Dante, but that everybody ought to realize that God will become available. You got to sort of keep your antenna up, and God will come to meet you where you are.
And Dante, while writing this poem, is coming to people where they are. I mean, is he trying to convert people or to speak to them?
Yes, in a larger sense. I mean, I don't think this is a book about arm twisting. But one thing we know is that even in Dante's lifetime, people were, because he brought out the Divine Comedy in 3 pieces. The Paradiso wasn't finished till almost the time he died, but the Inferno and Purgatory there were already people reading to crowds in the streets because Dante made the big decision to write in Tuscan. He didn't write in Latin. There are lots of Latin poems written in the Middle Ages. And obviously Dante read Latin, or he couldn't have read Thomas Aquinas and the Bible and all these other things. But Dante is writing in the vernacular. And by the way, during the Renaissance, he was widely criticized for that. Dante did everything right, except he wrote in the wrong damn language, is what some Renaissance scholars will say. Why did he do that? It's the vulgar tongue. And Dante did that deliberately. And by the way, Roberto Benigni, do you know who he is? He made a movie called, oh my God, what's it called now? Anyway, he made a movie where he's got his kids during World War II and he's sort of teaching them and playing games with it. You know what I mean?
Life is Beautiful, I think, yeah.
That's right. Yes, that's right. Well, anyway, Roberto Benigni in later years, now what he does, he goes around Italy reading Dante out loud. I mean, in groups. And I know this best because I have an apartment in Siena. He came to Siena and read in the Piazza del Campo, the most beautiful piazza in the world. And he's got thousands of people listening to him because people who are Tuscans, Siena's in Tuscany, they still speak Tuscan, which is now the Italian language, basically, but also every child in Italy reads Dante in high school. So everybody has some acquaintance. And now he's getting these people to come on a Sunday afternoon or a Tuesday night or whatever it is, and come and listen to him read the Divine Comedy. That's been going on since the time Dante was still alive, when only part of the Divine Comedy was written. So this is obviously a work that can be understood at very different levels. But it's also a good story. And especially the first part of it's a good story because you got, all these things going on in hell. People turning into trees and people being buried in the ground and, people having animals nip at them and people frozen in the ice. And, those are graphic enough stories that they can keep you interested for a while. There's a reason that colleges have students read Inferno rather than Paradiso if they're only going to read one part of the Divine Comedy. Paradiso is really hard, especially if you haven't read the other two parts. Inferno, there's something for everybody in a sense to sort of grab your interest. Whether you're learning about people who have been guilty of lust and you can sort of imagine, oh my gosh, is this what's going to happen to me? So the vernacular is his choice to say, yes, I'm bringing my story, which is very personal, but it's also universal. It's the middle of our life. Okay. Our plural, life singular. That's what you need to know. It's every man and it's one at a time.
And how did you came to know the poem? And if I may ask, if you can choose, what is your favorite canto of all?
Well, I did not read it in college, actually. I read a lot of good books in college, but not that. I became a medieval historian, and I taught church history. So I'm interested in theology and a lot of the things that Dante brings up in the Divine Comedy. And I have a friend of mine here on campus with whom I made the series for the great courses that you heard, Professor Hersman. He lives across the street from me. We've been buddies for a long time. And he's a literature professor. So he had taught Dante and I never had, but I had done a lot of research in Italy. So we had my sort of historical research in Italy, and we wanted to teach a course together. So the question was, what are we going to teach? And it was Dante. I had to do more work than he did to get ready. I had a lot more historical background, but much less literary understanding than he did. And we began teaching the course together, which we did for 35 years. And so during that time, I had the opportunity not only to put all my historical knowledge to work, but also to sort of steal his understanding that I got from all the literature stuff. And we started out teaching a course where I would do a history part, he would do a literature part. And one day, we literally don't remember who, one of us interrupted the other and said, let me say something. And from that time, it was a dialogue. And so our views got very mixed together as they were in the great courses course. We don't do, I do a history lecture, he does a literature lecture. We have a dialogue back and forth. And I think that's something that Dante would like, that you have people who are different human beings, but also have different expertises and focuses of their work. And yet Dante brings them together in a really sort of a, if I may say so, divine conversation. And so that's how I got to be a part of that. Ron, my friend, has written a lot more meaty articles about Dante than I have. We've written several together. And we've done a lot of lectures together on Dante. But both of us benefited from the fact that I had a more historical background. I knew who a lot of these folks were who were in hell, purgatory, and heaven. Ron had the literary background. Ron had actually read Virgil in Latin, for God's sake. I certainly had never done that at the time. So it was a wonderful, I guess we would probably say today, coincidental coming together. But of course, looked at from Dante's perspective, this was something that neither of us planned, but it was sort of, if you will, in the works.
Yeah. And there's such a beautiful symmetry to the course and to the lectures that you bring together. I mean, it's almost like you finish each other's sentences, and I'm listening to it and I'm thinking, did they plan it all? I mean, did they plan that William will going to say this sentence and Ron will say that? And I don't know.
The
Did
answer
you?
to that, by the way, is completely no.
No.
We had no script like that at all. We knew where we had to get to.
Mm.
So, for example, sometimes there's a tendency to say, "Boy, I really want to pick up on this," and I know we've got 5 minutes to do two more points. You don't do it, but we've all sort of figured that out. We didn't really have a strategy that we had designed, and we haven't taught together since I retired in 2012. But we've given some talks together, and we're still that way. We really just don't rehearse at all, and that was great fun. We also wrote a book together called The Medieval Worldview. That's a very different kind of process where this is, of course, pre-computer and everything. We literally cut and pasted. We had one room in Ron's house. He had a bigger house than I did. That basically nobody, his kids and his wife, couldn't go into because we had stuff scattered all over the floor, and we knew what the piles were, but nobody else knew what was in those piles. So you couldn't pick them up and move them. And so we've done that kind of work with the written word, but in our oral presentations as opposed to our written work. No, we really trust each other. And every now and then, I'm probably secretly saying to myself, "Come on, Ron, shut up for a minute." And I'm sure he's saying the same thing to me under his breath. But by and large, I think we really do understand each other and know each other's gifts and what the others know. And so I don't think we ever had to stop the taping and say, "Oh gosh, you had two people talking at the same time." And that was all without a script. That's a great gift, by the way, for us, one to the other. I just saw him a few minutes ago, by the way. Again, he lives across the street.
Wow, cool. So almost last question. I mean, because I have a recurrent question at the end of each episode, but I have to ask. Would it be justified to say that Dante's crush on Beatrice is the biggest crush in literature, almost overrated because they never married? She died quite young, and he was married. He had kids, as you said, but he still idolizes her to the point of making her almost an angel.
Yes, that's true. And of course, the question of Beatrice, scholars have spent an awful lot of time on it. I think most people, he talks about the fact they met 3 times, and at the ages of 9, 18, and 27. And you can go to Florence and buy postcards that show these different meetings of. They usually have it on the Ponte Vecchio in Florence, which of course didn't exist in Dante's time, but what the hell, an anachronism here and there is okay. But obviously she serves as a person in Dante's life, but her real value to Dante only comes after she's long been dead. That is to say, in what she does for him in initiating the question to God. This poor guy is doing such, he's just so screwed up. Can we make some extraordinary thing to get him on a road to heaven? I mean, that's his value as he spiritualizes her. But certainly, I think we could say, in part, Beatrice is responsible for him becoming a love poet. And he wrote love poetry, very good love poetry, that still exists, of course. But many people would say, if you ask Dante the day he finished the Divine Comedy, "Tell us about your love poetry," I think he would say, "I just finished my great love poetry." I think he would see, as one way of looking at his poem, it is his last and best love poem. And of course, Beatrice is central to that. And so we don't know, again, she died when she was 27. We don't know if they had an affair. By the way, Dante never mentions his wife and children in the Divine Comedy, even though he has a wife and children. And the first person to sort of really get, I guess we would say, the poem of Dante in circulation was one of his sons, who presumably lived with him in exile in Ravenna. We don't know that. But we lose track of Mrs. Dante. That's not her name. His last name is Alighieri. But we lose track of her Um, and so in many ways, Beatrice is, if she originally to Dante represented a kind of physical love, clearly he spiritualizes her and realized that there's something that opened his heart. There's something that made him available to something other than himself, that took away from him and focused on something else that Beatrice gave him that he never fully appreciated when she was alive. It was only on reflection that he came to understand what he sees in the Divine Comedy as her essential role in his life. The only other person Dante meets that has kind of a personal relationship with, and not literally, is his great-great-grandfather, Cacciaguida. He meets somebody to talk about the family when he gets to heaven. But Beatrice, I think it's fair to say the Divine Comedy is his last and greatest love poem. And I think to see it in that way, even though it's not the genre of traditional love poetry, it's not written in that style, it is a love poem because he realized that in many ways his love of Beatrice was far more important than he realized when she was alive. That she has been something steady in his life, something that ultimately has been one of his ways of getting beyond the lust of which he's guilty and so on, and moving toward salvation. So it is a love poem, although you'd never guess it until you get all the way to the end, where we actually see the ultimate love in the Trinity, and where we see Dante sort of waving to Beatrice, whom he meets and goes through heaven with, but then she takes her place back in what we call the mystic rose, and his final guide, Bernard Clairvaux, saying, "Look over there, there's Beatrice waving at you." And so he sort of waves this last goodbye to her as she's taken her seat around the throne of God. And so Beatrice is part of this poem in a way beyond just her guiding Dante through the last third. The whole thing is a love poem to her.
Yeah, and he did promise in La Vita Nuova that he's going to write her a
That's right. Something
better
great.
poem.
That's right.
Yeah,
This is not worthy. He did.
he did. Yeah,
He kept his word.
exactly. So I finish. First of all, thank you for this lovely talk, and you said that you retired in 2012,
That's right.
and you taught Dante, I'm guessing, for a few decades before that.
Yes.
And we can still feel the love that you feel for the poem. And yeah, and when I told you that Borges thought that Dante was the greatest poem, you immediately agreed.
Yes. Well, let me give you a footnote to this, though.
Yeah.
I retired in 2012. And when I retired, I did what every professor said he was going to do. You ask professors, what are you going to do? You had a great career and so on and so forth. You say, well, I'm going to do what I've always done, but I don't have to grade papers or go to department meetings. And for 3 years, that's what I did. I read a lot. I still read a lot. And I give a lot of lectures and did some writing. And that wasn't enough to satisfy me. And, again, you're thinking, Dante, I'm on a journey. Journeys always imply change. I got to do something else. I felt sort of I'm not going to just sit here and read and not do gradings of papers until I die. I want to do something else, and I started a charity. And so I have a charity called the Bill Cook Foundation, and we help poor children go to school all over the world. And I spend, I don't know, 3 or 4 months of my year either raising money or visiting. I was in South Sudan recently. I was in Kenya. I was in Uganda. I was in Ethiopia. Last year, I was in Laos and Cambodia. We've got projects in India, and I was just in Latin America. So it isn't that Dante did anything like that, or Dante talked about, specific things that relate to that. But I knew I wanted to help people learn because I've been an educator. So it's an educational foundation. And although I don't think probably any of the students we're supporting now, we have some university students, but mostly these are elementary schools that we built and that sort of thing. They're not reading Dante, but in some real sense, it's that need I had to fulfill that wasn't being fulfilled by sitting around and hanging out in my house all day. And so, in some ways, Dante's remained a part of me because, you know, 65 is, not the middle of your life anymore. But when you're, I think I was 68 when I retired, but when you're 68, you've got probably some more years left. So, Dante's sort of an inspiration. It's never too late to change. That's Dante's message. I can keep going being a successful, politician, maybe. I can go on being a successful father and husband, maybe. I can go on being all these things, but I got to be ready to reinvent myself. And Dante reinvented himself at the age of 35. And at about 70, I reinvented mine. And part of that is simply I live in that worldview that Dante's put in the center of my worldview. So Dante has a lot to do with the fact there is a Bill Cook Foundation, and there are 380 girls going to high school in South Sudan who wouldn't have been able to go otherwise. And that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's very
morning.
cool. Yeah. I like the idea of reinventing yourself in any age. Yeah, that's a beautiful concept.
You've got a couple more to go probably at your age.
Yeah. I mean, I've just left my full-time job to pursue, online writing and be, a free agent. I like to think of that. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Believe me, you'll have. The only thing I can promise you, especially as somebody who reads and teaches Dante, there are going to be some surprises along the way.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And
so
you got to embrace them. And you got to embrace them.
Yeah.
Dante could have said, I ain't going on this trip to Virgil when Virgil appears. What are you talking about? But he sort of sucked it up and did. And because he had dangled in front of him, he might get to meet Beatrice at the end. And you got to think, what would I change for? What would make me happy enough that I would change, at least to some extent, the direction of my life? I mean, Dante just makes you ask those questions. You don't ask them as him because you aren't him. You don't ask him as a 14th century Italian because you're not a 14th century Italian. You have to translate those things into your personality and your world. But Dante gives you a model to look at, a way of thinking about it.
And again, the idea of you just need to listen to your heart because the truth is already there. That's a very powerful idea that I think he gives you. Yeah.
You got to clear the junk away. I mean, that's really what it amounts to. You just got to clear the junk away. And that very first moment when he meets Virgil, and he meets Virgil because his first response was after waking up in the dark wood of error is, oh, well, I must have gotten here somehow. I'll get myself out. And of course, he starts climbing a mountain, and three different animals, whom we know represent categories of sin, sort of attack him. And he gives up. I can't get out of here. And then we see Virgil coming. So at some point, you're when you sort of see you're kind of down, the first response might be, oh, I got myself here. I got myself in here. I'll get myself out of here. Dante says, you got to be a little bit more patient. You got to listen a little bit more. You got to consider more possibilities of what that means to get out of the dark wood of error. And everybody's journey is not going to be his, because Beatrice doesn't turn me on and never did. I'm not going anywhere for Beatrice, but there are things or people in my life that I would do something to follow. So it's a wonderful, brilliant poem. It's got 17 million footnotes. But it's a poem that really, ultimately, of course, you deal with your intellect. It's a poem about the heart.
Yeah,
it really is.
I think I did get my answer for the first question. Do you need to learn all the history and all of the, I don't know, intellectual facts? And you don't. I mean, you have to communicate with this poem on a more poetic and emotional level. Yeah.
I always tell students, don't look at all the footnotes. If you're reading along and you just can't quite figure out what's going on, then go look at that footnote and sort of get past that. But it's not about reading all the footnotes and knowing who every person is that Dante refers to. We don't even know who everybody is. I mean, some of the people are unknown to us. he basically meets a guy who seems to be the Florentine town drunk, for example, in Inferno 6. And we don't really know who this guy Chaco is. He doesn't make it into the documents that survive on Florence. So, you can use the introductions and the notes as you need them. But your goal is to understand and immerse yourself in the poem, not ultimately to be able to pass a test about it.
Yeah, and to read the whole poem, as you
And
said.
to read the whole poem. That's right. Get out of the sewer.
Yeah. So, William, again, thank you for this very lovely conversation. And it was a pleasure. And I think we got some keys to start to unlock this poem.
Good. Well, you're going to begin in the dark wood. And the good news is that the last thing Dante does is see God face to face. And then, this is the part that people forget. At the end of the poem, when he sees God face to face, the next thing is Dante's coming back to earth with that experience now under his belt. Dante's life doesn't end in heaven right now. It does eventually, we hope. But Dante's mission is to go back to Italy now, to go back to where he lived, where all those temptations and all those false roads came from. So, after you read, and I'd say to anybody, after you read the poem, okay, you got to take what you've learned and now go back. Got to get back to the daily life and see if this hasn't, in some ways, changed and made better that life.